Good morning. Now, Mr. Connell, our first witness, I understand, is joining us remotely.
That is correct. Technology willing, my lord. The witness this morning is Karen Connelly, who joined us from France, I understand. I hope.
Do you have the stylus? Maybe in the hall. Thank you. I do understand we managed to make contact earlier this morning.
I understand that is indeed correct. Contact was made and sound was tested eventually.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Would you be possible to just leave them and rejoin again, please?
The WebEx?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Good morning, Miss Connelly. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can.
Right.
Good morning.
Good morning. We seem to have a little glitch, but it may now be sorted.
Yeah.
As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who you may also be able to see, and certainly when he is asking questions, you should be able to see him. But first, understand you're prepared to make an affirmation.
Yes, I am.
Right. Could you repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Ms. Connelly. Now, I don't know how long your evidence will take. It may take much of the morning. We usually take a break at 11:30 our time. But if for any reason you want to take a break at any time, just give an indication and we can do that. But I'll now hand you over to Mr. Connell.
Thank you, my lord. Ms. Connelly, good morning.
Good morning.
I hope you can now see me, at least at this point.
Yes, I can.
We may, on occasion during your evidence, ask you to look at documents, and I understand you have a means by which that can be done.
I do, yes.
And I think you've been given an indication in advance of documents that you may be asked to look at, so you had a chance to have a little look in advance. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you very much. Now, am I right in understanding that you have provided a witness statement with which you're familiar, and are you content to adopt that as your evidence at this inquiry?
Yes, I am.
Thank you very much. Can I just also ask, based not on anything that you have done at all, but in other experience, because you're a remote witness, if you would be good enough not to receive messages, emails, WhatsApps or the like during your evidence, that would be very helpful.
Of course.
Thank you very much. Now, just a little bit of background, if we can start with that. Your presence as part of one team or another at what I'll just call for short the Queen Elizabeth Hospital was sporadic, in the sense you were there at one time, then you went away to other jobs, then you came back temporarily, then you went away again. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And in outline, your position was that you were part of the project team between the summer of 2009 and about the middle of 2015. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And then you went off to do other things. You returned for a period of a few months, I think, as illness cover. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you remember who you were covering for?
I believe it was David McDonald, the site facilities manager.
Thank you. And then you went back to other tasks that you were doing elsewhere within the board. And then you came back in a general manager role, is that right, in January 18?
That's correct, yes.
And was that a general post with a kind of wide-ranging estate responsibility?
It was general manager for estates and facilities for the Queen Elizabeth campus.
Thank you. And I think you remained in that about the middle of 2019, is that
That's
correct?
correct, yes.
When you moved and ultimately you retired in 2020, am I correct about that?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you very much. Now, when you were in the project team, in your first stint at the, or associated with the new hospital,
Yes.
you were dealing, as I understand it, with responsibilities centred on something called soft facilities as opposed to hard facilities. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
I rather unkindly described this to a colleague recently as pillows rather than bricks. But am I right in understanding that it can sometimes be called the hotel side of facilities as opposed to the building side specifically?
Yes, it was once known as hotel services, and in the last few years it became facilities and estates, yes.
Right. And in fact, your background, as you helpfully set out in your witness statement, was initially in catering, and before you moved into healthcare work on facilities,
That's
and then
correct.
ultimately general estates work. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, just to give us a very quick idea, when you were on that project team, what kind of things were you, wearing your soft facilities hat, looking at? Because I can understand you say in your statement, for instance, you were looking at the design of the kitchens. That's a perfectly logical thing. But apparently you were also looking at automated guided vehicles.
Yes, that's correct. That was one of the biggest innovations for soft facilities within the new hospital, was the system of automated vehicles, because they would transport a lot of goods and services, including the catering trolleys, linen cages, waste bins, etc. So they were going to reduce particularly the manual handling, which was normally undertaken by our portering staff. So it was a big innovation for us within the hospital. So there was quite a lot of work involved in it, and it was new to Scotland. No other hospital had this system, so we had to do a lot of investigation into it.
Yeah. And when you were working in that project team, did you have any kind of guidance as to what you were required to deliver at the end of it? Was there somewhere you went to find the parameters of what the different teams had to end up delivering?
No, I didn't have a job description, if that's what you mean, in terms of my membership of the project team. I had previously been worked as the commissioning manager for the new Victoria Hospital. So I think Alec McIntyre at the time thought, with my experience of that, then I would be a fit for the new Queen Elizabeth Hospitals project. So I didn't have anything in writing to say what my role was, but it evolved over time in terms of what I was looking at in regard to the soft facilities side.
Thank you. Did you have occasion to come across something called board construction requirements?
I did indeed, yes. Yes.
And what were they?
Well, the board construction requirements were the sort of, well, we sort of refer to it as the Bible in terms of what was outlined within the contract that the board expected to be delivered by the construction company.
Thank you. When you were working on that project side, did you have occasion to get involved with anybody from the infection control side?
Yes, there was always somebody from the infection control that was part of the project team. Initially, when I started in 2009, Annette Rankin was the infection control nurse member of the team, and then she moved off to another post, another organisation, and she was replaced by Jackie Stewart, was the infection control nurse that was part of the project team.
Thank you. Now, I'm just, as you probably gather, I'm taking the order of my questions from your witness statement, broadly speaking. So if you need to refer to it at any stage, please just do indicate. Another thing I was going to ask you whether you came across was something called BREEAM, B-R-E-E-A-M.
Yes, that was a requirement for the previous commissioning role I had, but also with the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, that BREEAM was a very high priority objective for the new hospitals to achieve this BREEAM award.
In your witness statement, you don't need to look it up at the moment because it's just a very short point I'm wanting to take from you. When you asked about BREEAM, you said you would describe BREEAM as being a very important factor for the project director. It was a priority for him to achieve this as an award. Why did you phrase your answer like that? Was this something that was made known to you?
I don't think so. I think it was generally what was felt within the project team that this was, it was almost like it was a good achievement for the building to meet the criteria of the BREEAM in terms of its efficiency.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to jump ahead and then come back again, just by asking you a couple of general things. Do I take it from your background and experience that certainly in the period on the project team, you wouldn't have regarded yourself as an expert in either water systems or ventilation systems?
Not at all, no.
Thank you. I wonder if you could look at a document. It's bundle 17, document 70 at page 2855. This is an email sent to you in December 2009. I think you were asked about it and dealt with it in your witness statement, and it's sent to you by a Mark Baird, who I think the inquiry is aware is with a firm called Curry and Brown. Now, according to your witness statement, you just joined the team at that point. Is that right?
Yes, I think it was September, mid to end of September, I joined the project team in 2009, yes.
Right. And why was this, which appears to relate to something called the M&E log and the ventilation strategy, why was it sent to you?
Well, that's what I did say in my witness statement. I mean, I have no recollection of this document, but I did say that the project team was currently based in offices in Hillington at this point. This was before the project team offices were established on the Queen Elizabeth site. And also there was meetings held, early morning meetings. As you can see, this email was sent to me at 8:15 in the morning. And the only thing I can ask, though, that there were people were gathered in the project offices for a meeting, and somebody asked me to print off at that time in 2009. Not everybody had access to laptops or iPads, so there was still a lot of paper copies about. So I was usually in early in the morning, maybe before the admin people. So and that's the only thing I can honestly think of in terms of why I would have been sent that, because there's no there's no other email trail associated with. It's just that email with no message on it. So
yeah. And had you anything to do with the substantive content of that email, the M&E log or the ventilation strategy?
Absolutely not, no.
So other than the fact that you can see it was sent to you and you think it might have been for printing, you know nothing about it. Is that fair?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you very much. If we move forward a little bit until we start to look to the period when you were heading towards handover, so handover from the contractors to the board. You were asked one question about cleaning, the kind of issues that arose about cleaning at the time. And you said that cleaning issues were affected by ongoing work and also by incomplete work having to be completed. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
What was the problem there?
We had, as part of our building readiness programme within Soft FM, we had a schedule in terms of how we were going to clean the building, do what we'll call a clinical clean for the building in readiness for the migration of patients into the building. So we had a programme of how we would do that, but it was subsequently affected because that we maybe cleaned rooms, and then subsequently we discovered that there were defects in the room, so there were contractors going back in and doing more work to the room, which meant we had to clean it again. So that was quite a common issue that our domestic staff had to deal with at the time.
Thank you. I just wanted to come to another question. I'm sorry if these don't necessarily link in logical order, but we won't be going through the whole of your statement. You'll be pleased to know we don't need to ask you about everything. But at electronic page 340 of your statement, we'll just bring that up. You, at the foot of that page, you're asked about something called water flushing, and then you say that you arrange with domestic services manager for the domestic staff to incorporate the flushing of taps in clinical areas into the cleaning regime at the request of the estates team, and records were completed. Now, are you able to give us, and I appreciate it's a while ago now, but are you able to give us any more information about what exactly staff were being told to do here that you're talking about?
Yes, well, the domestic staff, as part of their cleaning duties, were asked to flush all water outlets within each room, en suite, within any in the general ward environments for a period. I think it was 2 minutes at a time, and they had to do that every day to make sure that the water was being flushed through the system.
And
sorry, we just had dozens, or tens of, maybe, I don't know when we'd reached 100, but there was, a lot of domestics within the building at that point. So they were well placed as they were going to the wards on a daily basis for them to be able to do that flushing. So
the flushing for 2 minutes every day of all the water outlets, is that what your recollection is? And you said that records were completed. Were these electronic or paper, can you remember?
They were paper records, yes.
And was anyone charged with checking that this was done?
Not that I recall. The paper records were handed into the office at the front desk, probably by the domestic supervisors once they were collated by the domestic assistants. But whether anybody actually went through them to verify that all areas had been done, I can't say. I have no recollection of that being done.
Thank you. Another sort of question about checking, if I may. On a later page of your statement, you explain that there was a supervisor for Capita carrying out checks to the building, and people like yourself and other members of the team were asked to do a program of checks before handover and record what you found. Can you remember doing that, or what it was you did?
There were a number of folders made up for members of the project team, even for those of us that had not actually been involved in checking for defects or doing any sign off of rooms. So there was a number of us all participated in this, and we were given folders, we were allocated areas to go with checklists to tick off what was done or what hadn't been done in each of the rooms.
And can you remember? Sorry, that's the problem with online. I mustn't speak over you. Please finish your answer.
It was just to say we were given certain areas to look at and a number of rooms to do, and then we to bring those folders back. So,
can you remember what you were reporting back hadn't been done?
Yes, it might have been maybe the finishes in terms of joints on flooring. It could have been paint. Maybe paint finishes hadn't been completed. There were scuff marks on walls, that type of thing. Generally not a sort of engineering or electrical point of view, but generally something you could see visually.
Thank you. Do I take it from your answer to the earlier question that in effect you were a disparate group of people being asked to help out by doing that checking task?
Yes. Well, we were members of the project team, so we knew the building was inside out.
Right.
So we were equipped in that way to be able to find our way about and to know what we were looking for. But we were all, as I say, members of the project team itself.
Thank you. Now, I wonder if we could look at bundle 12 at page 66. Now, this isn't very easy to read, but I'm told it's a process for recording defects and issues so that there was a record of them being dealt with. I don't know whether you've had a chance, at least briefly, to look at that.
I have, yes.
Yes. You were asked about it in your witness statement. I just want to make sure we understand the answer that you've given, which is at 344 of your witness statement. And I think what you'd said in your witness statement was that you hadn't seen this before. You were shown it for the purposes of your witness statement, but it would have been informative to have seen it at the time. And then the questioner asks you, how would it have been informative? And you say, well, I would have known the size and scale. But ultimately, we managed to migrate the patients into the hospital. I don't think it would have any impact on how the project turned out. Can you just help us understand this comment about not having that document, not really having any impact, just so we can understand what you're trying to explain to us?
Right. It was the list of the defects that was prepared by Capita Simmons in relation to the handover documentation. So I don't recall having seen it at the time, but I suppose what I meant was that the list in terms of the defects that I was referring to in terms of where maybe flooring hadn't been completed or where the walls had been damaged and they were subsequently repaired, then all that work was done. So therefore we were able to carry on with the cleaning and get set up from a soft facilities perspective and do as much as we can before the migration of the patients into the buildings.
Thank you. And did you manage to get all of that done before the patients migrated?
We managed to, from a soft facilities perspective, which I'm speaking of, we were able to get all the rooms cleaned and everything set up as required for the patients to be migrated.
Thank you. Now, I just want to ask you briefly about one or two other things, some of which we've heard about from other witnesses. I think you've probably heard the phrase asset tagging.
Yes.
And you know what that is, I take it?
Yes.
And I think we've heard from other witnesses that it's an essential part of being able to do planned preventative maintenance. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
So the only thing I wanted to ask you about that was to give us some idea of when you remember it got resolved. You were asked about that in your witness statement. And you said, well, you weren't involved in this at the time of handover, but it was still an issue in 2018 when you came back to your estates manager role. Is that correct?
General manager for estates and facilities, yes, that's correct. It was still an ongoing issue. I think Ian Powry was heavily involved in dialogue with Brookfield at the time to make sure that this was all done. And yes, I mean, it was a key requirement for within the board's requirements to have this asset tagging, just as you've described, in terms of making sure that the equipment was properly maintained and that you would have a planned replacement programme in place as well once that equipment came to the end of its lifespan. So I think it was essential to have.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, I just have a question for you associated with the topic of chilled beams, but you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to ask you about any of the technicalities of chilled beams because that's not your area of expertise. But I think you were aware that there had been some issues with chill beams and drips and black stuff and so on. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Yes.
And just in a couple of sentences, tell us when you first realised that there was an issue that impacted on your areas of concern.
Well, when we got reports that there was either water on floors or this black substance coming out of the chill beam and hitting, either it was hitting patient equipment within the bedrooms, or maybe it was creating a health and safety risk in terms of water on the floors. So our domestic staff were called to rectify whatever contamination had been found within the room.
But I think this allows me to ask you a general question, because obviously you have knowledge of issues around the cleaning regimes. If, say, a nurse or another member of the nursing staff and the like thought there was anything substandard with the cleaning that had been carried out in a particular location, was there any method of them reporting that to you?
Yes, well, they could do it directly with the domestic supervisors. There would be domestic assistants would be allocated to each ward, and each domestic assistant would have a supervisor to report to. So they could contact the supervisors, and that could get escalated if required by the supervisor to the domestic management, and subsequently up to myself if it was serious enough. Yes.
Thank you. Headings were used as your witness statement was put together, and I'm coming to one which, oddly enough, given your knowledge, is under the heading of water maintenance. So could we go to 369, please? What I'm going to ask you here are about SOPs. So, which I think we know means standard operating practices, is that correct?
The standing operating procedures, yes.
All right, standing operating procedures.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And you say at the top of that page that when you arrived in January 2018, you had responsibility for these teams, which included all SOPs were adhered to. And can you just tell us, how did you organise that these got done?
Well, again, it was through our, excuse me, we had daily team briefs. So obviously there was standard operating procedures that were in place from very early doors. I mean, they were in common usage throughout the health board in all departments. But obviously, as we became more operational within the building, then there was new operating procedures needed to be developed. So there was usually whether the appropriate people, whether it was the domestic service managers, would work with infection control to work out what these procedures were to be. They would be written up, they would be agreed, and then they would be put into the folders, the domestic services folders, which they adhere to in terms of all their operating procedures. So it was up to the supervisors and the domestic services managers to make sure that the staff were carrying out the procedures as written.
And I think on that page, you point out that as time went on, new issues arose about which new SOPs had to be created. For instance, you mentioned point of use filters, which was something you had no experience on. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And did that involve training, or what did you do when something new like that cropped up?
I did. We developed a SOP with infection control in terms of what the domestic should and shouldn't do in regard to the point of use filters being applied to the taps and shower heads within the wards. So as well as the SOP, then there was training carried out. Again, we used a sort of cascade method in terms of managers would train supervisors would then train the domestics on the correct use and implementation of the standard operating procedure.
And perhaps just to correct a small, which I think is a typographical error, In the middle of that page, there's a note saying new concerns have been raised regarding the drain pipe work, but actually that should be the drain space pipe work. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you explain later that this had been raised because you think it might have been Teresa Inkster had thought the design of the drains could be causing splashback. Do you remember that cropping up?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you very much. I wonder if we could just look briefly at another document, please, which is Bundle 1 of June 23, page 9. No, that can't be right. I've got the wrong one. Sorry, that's my mistake. We should be looking at page 96 of that bundle. This is a section from an incident management team meeting about a water incident where I think you were present. We can go back, if we could just go back to 94, please. We find you, I think you're there. Yes, you are. This is a meeting you're present at. Can you just help us? Why were you there? What was your role at a meeting like this?
Was this in 2018? I'm sorry, I've lost the heading of that.
So it's the 4th of June 2018. It's an IMT meeting about heading into water system incident. Yeah.
At that time, I was the general manager for estates and facilities. Given the nature of the water incident, then I was it was part of my remit to attend.
Yeah. And was there something about the cleaning of drains that cropped up at that time that was new?
Yes, up until that point, there'd been it certainly wasn't part of the domestic cleaning schedules that they should do anything with actual drains on washhand basins. And I understand around that time as well that there was no guidance or drain cleaning. It was said that they shouldn't be cleaned, and I think that was to prevent any possible contamination. So, but the group, the water system incident led us to reviewing that, and they introduced a programme of washing the drains. But again, we had to work through how that would actually be done, whether patients could be in the room at the time, and how much agitation should be used, what cleaning materials or chemicals should be used to do that.
And were these decisions ones that you were contributing to in a technical sense, or were you to deal with implementation?
I would say I was not technically able to contribute to that decision making. I supported the group because the experts were around the table, and certainly a big part of my role was then to make sure it was implemented along with estates and facilities colleagues, along with infection control, obviously.
And just so we're clear, and perhaps to avoid looking at repeated IMT minutes, would I be right in thinking that that was generally your role if you attended meetings of this kind? You were to make sure that what needed done got done?
Yes, I would agree.
Thank you very much. Ask you another question. Did you become aware of something that's generally called the DMA Canyon report of 2015?
Latterly, I can't even remember when, whether it was into 2019 before I was actually aware that this report had been provided and it hadn't been acted on.
Can we go back to your witness statement, in fairness to you, so we can see what you said when you were asked about that? Go to 376. And the questioner asks you when you first became aware of the DMA Canyon, another typo, 2015 report, and you say, I don't remember, it may have been 2018.
18, it could have been, I'm not clear on dates, so yes, it could have been 2018 or 2019.
And how did you, if it was 2018, you'd be back in the hospital as estates manager.
Yes.
Can you remember how it came to your attention?
Mary Ann Kane told me about it.
And did she tell you any more other than there was this report? And did you get any more information about it?
No, I didn't. I don't think it was up for general discussion.
So she just mentioned it to you as far as your recollection goes?
She mentioned that there was a serious issue, and it was regarding a report that had been received in 2015 that hadn't been actioned, and it was now coming to the fore, and it was a serious matter. So I think there were other discussions regarding that report going off, but I wasn't party to them.
Right. Thank you very much. Could we move on to 379, which is both on and back at the same time, because we see a heading on that page, which is the water incident of 2018. Now, you only arrived back in January of 2018. Can you remember what the state of play was about what became called the water incident when you got there?
My recollection was that it was still a case of trying to ascertain where the problems were arising from. So there had been these IMT groups set up previously that I'd been told about. And then obviously when I joined in January 2018, I started to attend IMTs. So there was a lot of anxiety at the time, excuse me.
What, just so we can get that question in context, you were saying there was a lot of anxiety at the time. Can you just explain that a little further? Why was there a lot of anxiety?
I think because there was measures being taken to resolve the problem in terms of flushing, etc. Additional cleaning methods been put in place, but it didn't seem to stop the infections occurring. So it was an ongoing process. Just when we thought that there had been a solution found, then something else seemed to pop up that required further action to be taken.
And I think you attended a number of IMTs in your capacity as estates manager at that time. Is that correct?
I did, yes.
Can we just look, perhaps it linked to your previous answer, page 380. Now, in the bottom half of that page, you're being asked about these IMTs on the water incident. And you
Yes.
say, what do you recall about how matters managed? And you describe it as a very intense period.
Yes.
So what was the tension about?
Well, I think just as I've said, that we had these problems with the water and we didn't seem to be resolving the issues, and that the infections were still coming up. So, and obviously there was a lot of intensive work by estate staff, infection control staff, facility staff, in terms of trying to resolve the situation. So so yes, it was very intense in that way.
You quite an interesting phrase appeared in that answer. You say you were trying to both find a cause and a solution at the same time.
Yes.
Thank you. again, just to get your role in context, the inquiry is aware that something called the Water Technical Group was formed and sat on dates in 2018 and 2019. And were you a member of that group after it was set up and while you were a general manager?
Yes, I was. I did attend several of those meetings, yes.
And did you have a particular role at these meetings?
No, again, similar to the IMT in terms of my responsibility to make sure that what actions recommended by the water safety group were carried out.
Thank you. And let me ask you then about another group. Is there something called the Board Water Safety Group? You remember that?
Yes, yes.
And when you were asked about that in your witness statement, you said you attended for the first time in December 2018 in your capacity as a general manager.
Right.
And what was the function of the Board Water Safety Group?
It was an overarching water safety group for the whole of the board, so that representatives from each of the sectors within Glasgow, estates managers in particular and general managers all attended, and there was a set agenda. There was infection control colleagues, infection control doctors, clinical staff were represented on that group. So it was the board's the highest group, if you like, in terms of water safety for the board.
And what, so far as you could gather, and you won't have been at that many meetings because you only started going in December 2018.
Yeah.
As far as you could work out, what was the group meant to achieve?
Water safety, that there was that the water systems throughout all hospitals within the board had safe water.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to move on to a completely different topic now. Thank you for these answers. And I want to ask you about a situation which you had some involvement in when a decision was taken to close wards 2A and B and move the patients elsewhere, particularly to 6A. Do you remember that?
Yes, yes.
Can we just have your witness statement at 413, please? You're asked there about what led up to the decant from 2A, and you say it was a culmination of water drain and ventilation issues. Can you remember what the ventilation issues were?
I can't remember specifically what the technical details of the ventilation issues were.
I think there is an issue of controversy about what people were told at the time, but do you know what was eventually done to the ventilation system in 2A?
No, my understanding is it was a substantial amount of work to the ventilation system, because I think the initial decant was only to be for weeks or a couple of months, which then turned out to be, I can't remember, I don't know, I think I'd left before they'd even moved back into the ward, so that would have been 18 months or so that they were decanted. So I think when they started investigating the ventilation system within wards 2A and 2B, that much more detailed changes had to be made to it to make it suitable.
Thank you. In terms of process, you're asked about 2/3 of the way down page 413 who would have signed off on the move, and perhaps that question infers that would have been a single individual, Karen Connelly or someone.
Yes.
But you say, well, it's not the question of some individuals signing it off. Can you just explain your understanding of how a process like that, in particular the 2A move, was done?
Well, through the IMT was put together to resolve the issues, and the IMT came to the conclusion that the only way to resolve the water and ventilation issues within the wards was for them to be decanted. There was a lot of discussions about what other accommodation would have been suitable, and then they came to the conclusion that 6A was to be that. So that was agreed at the IMT by all members to say that this was the move that was required, and that would have been escalated up to director, chief executive level for them to make the final decision in terms of, because obviously there was other ward staff that would be impacted upon this move, i.e. the staff, the patients that were currently in 6A would have to be decanted. So it was no longer just a children's hospital issue, it was now becoming a much bigger issue, not just for the Queen Elizabeth, and then for Gartnavel General, who had to accommodate the patients that were relocated. So it couldn't be done just as a matter for the IMT, it had to be escalated.
Thank you. I think that the names you mentioned in your answer, in your witness statement, were Jane Grant, who I think we know was the CEO at the time, and Kevin Hill.
Yes, he was the director of children's services at the time, I think. Yeah.
And again, just so I'm sure I understood your answer, it becomes not just a question for the children's hospital because you're decanting to an adult ward. And then I think, did I pick you up correctly in saying that there's also further issues because you've got to decide where the patients from the adult ward have to go?
Correct, yes.
And some of them had to go to Gartnavel, is that right?
Yes, I believe the patients from 6A were transferred down to Gartnavel, and of course the staff would have to go with them as well, so there would have to be staff consultations in that regard too.
Thank you. You also asked if you knew anything about a risk assessment being done for this idea of moving the cohort that were in 2AB into 6A.
I really can't recall a risk assessment being done. I know there was certainly plenty of visits to Ward 6A by members of the clinical teams and infection control to find out if it was a suitable decant facility for them. But I can't say I can remember a risk assessment being carried out.
Thank you. You also asked, just on the next page of your statement, 414, if you had any concerns, wearing the hat that you were wearing, and you're saying, well, others had a greater understanding of the clinical and so on, clinical issues. But you thought there might be an issue about the facilities that were available in the wards.
Yes, Ward 2A and 2B had been designed specifically with that cohort of young, children in the ward. So there were facilities within that ward that we wouldn't provide in an adult ward, i.e. like a family room, playrooms for lessons, etc. So so I knew there would be differences in terms of the layout and the design of the rooms. So, but they were able to overcome those and make use of other rooms within the ward to accommodate these other requirements.
Thank you. In the same page of your statement, you're asked about another question, which was mold behind the IPS panels. Are these panels at the wash-hand basins?
Yes, these are panels that are fitted in what were essentially wet rooms within the ensuite shower and toilet facilities. So it was discovered when they were redoing some flooring in some of these areas before the decant that they took the panels off the wards, and I think there was some questions around them not being the appropriate type of panelling that should have been in a wet room, i.e. it wasn't the appropriate water resistant type. So there was concerns raised about that.
Thank you. Now, I think in the next section of your statement, you were asked about technical reports that were prepared on ventilation in wards 2A and 2B, and you say, well, you weren't involved in the instruction of these reports.
No.
You know generally what the concerns were that were being expressed about the ventilation in 2A and 2B?
Well, I think it was being the chilled beam model within the ward, I think was a concern, and also about positive and negative pressures within rooms as well. But that's as much as of my understanding of it.
Thank you. Well, let me come to a completely different topic, which is pigeons and Cryptococcus.
Yes.
Now, you start to deal with this in your witness statement, just so we know where we are at 418. I'll go back to the statement in a minute, but I'd just like to ask you a number of questions about this. You arrived as a general manager in 2018.
Correct, yes.
Now, in your capacity as an estates manager, did you have any understanding of what Cryptococcus was at that time?
Not Cryptococcus, no.
And did you know anything about a possible linkage between Cryptococcus and pigeon muck, if I can use that word?
No, not at that time, no.
Can you remember when you first learned there was a possible link between Cryptococcus on the one hand and pigeons and their output on the other?
Yeah, I think it was January 2019. I had been on leave for a period of time, and I came back, and my first day back, Mary-Ann Kane had asked me to attend a walk around of the plant rooms with herself. It was Colin Purdon, and I believe Dr. Inkster might have been present as well, because there had been suggestions that some linkage between infections was due to the pigeon mess around the hospital, and in some way that it's got into, whether it was a ventilation system or had got into patient rooms. So that was my sort of first experience of what turned out to be, you know, a big issue. Was there? That was, I think it was around about the 8th of January 2019.
Now, we'll come to the general question of pigeons. But would that mean that at the time, before you received this information, so far as pigeons were concerned, you weren't paying any particular attention to things like plant rooms where the air handling units were?
No, I wouldn't say that. We had pigeon problems on the Queen Elizabeth site. Formerly, even when it was the Southern General site, pigeons had been a problem. I think, as had across most of the hospitals in Glasgow, had pigeon issues. I was particularly involved in, again, one of my remits within the project team had been to get the new helipad up and running. We had to establish a firefighting and security team who ended up dealing with the helipad, and it was very early days that we had an issue with pigeons roosting on the helipad. So we had engaged with our pest control contractor to try numerous things of how to dislodge the pigeons from the helipad and other areas across the hospital campus.
Yeah. So you'd encountered it at that stage when you were part of the project team, which you finished in August 2015. We've heard from another witness that in terms of instructing action about pigeons, getting the pest control people in, or whatever phrase you want to use, that could be done by a variety of individuals. within the estate's function or elsewhere if they spotted a problem. Is that the way it worked?
No, the process for requesting a call out from the pest control company was done through the FM help desk. So if, for example, a catering supervisor in one of the regen kitchens discovered an issue with either silverfish or ants, whatever it was, they would phone the help desk, and the help desk would make the call direct to the pest control contractor. So there was very few people that would phone directly to the pest control company. That was normally done through the help desk. However, on occasion myself, I would phone directly, or possibly other members of estates or facilities would cover directly. But there was very few people that would do that call directly. It's normally done through the help desk.
Sure. Was there any system in place for someone to have an overview of what had been the issues and what were the issues on an ongoing basis?
Well, the help desk would keep records of all the calls out to the pest control company. Normally they would say what the nature of the call outs, whether it had been anything to do with pigeons, or when it had been, excuse me, any other form of pest that had been found. I mean, we had, approximately 50 wards on the campus, with each one of them would have their own ward pantry. So ward pantries sometimes got infections and ants, so that sort of thing. So they would all be recorded through that one system. But whether we had any analysis done in terms of what the makeup of all the calls were, I don't remember us doing that.
Yeah, I think the suggestion might be that if there'd been a problem in a particular area in the past, yes, fine, the pest control people were called out, a record was made of it, but then there was no linking of that, was there, to something that happens months later or a year later?
No, you're correct. It wasn't.
Thank you. And did you have any particular responsibilities to deal with pest control, and in particular pigeons? Let's leave ants out of it for the moment.
Well, yes, as I say, the helipad was obviously, it was another critical system for the Queen Elizabeth to have this helipad in operation. So we set up weekly cleans. We did install pigeon proofing within the helipad to try and minimise the impact of the pigeons. Any proofing, as we called it, against the pigeons was also had to be weighed up against animal rights, because we did have some near neighbours of the hospital site that were very keen on what methods we used to try and control the pigeons. So we had that to deal with as well. So we had to, sometimes in terms of the methods we used, we did have to be discreet in trying to eliminate them from the helipad and other areas across the site.
Now, I don't want individual names, but I'd just like to understand your answer there about you had neighbours who had views about what you did about pigeons. Now, I don't want to know about Mrs. Smith leaning out her window saying, "What are you doing with a pigeon?" But can you tell us what you're talking about there?
Well, it was just that whatever methodology, whereas, netting or spiking was common proofing methods that was used across many of the buildings on the hospital campus to try and stop the pigeons from roosting. But sometimes if we installed it in certain areas, then we would get emails or telephone calls. I didn't have any directly, but they usually went to our estates team in terms of, be careful, just to say that, these pigeons are creatures and we should be careful in terms of what you're doing. So that was something that we were mindful of, because there were more stringent methods that we could use in terms of pigeon control.
Thank you. Can I just come back to a question I asked you a minute or two ago? You told me about the helipad issue, but in your capacity as the estates manager from January 2018, did you have any specific responsibility to be in charge of control of pigeons?
Oh, yes. I mean, pest control responsibilities lay with estates and facilities. So my role as general manager on the Queen Elizabeth campus then said, yes, that remit sat with me to do something about it.
And when you said you went on a site visit with Mary-Ann Kane, Colin Purdon, possibly Teresa Inkster. And am I right in thinking that when you went on a site visit to plant rooms, you found that there was evidence of pigeon droppings there?
Yes, that's correct.
Was it possible for you to work out, either from that visit or otherwise, how long there'd been an issue with pigeon droppings in the plant rooms?
I don't think from the droppings I could make out how long there'd been an issue, but given that there was points of ingress to the plant roofs from outside, which we had to deal with, and getting those points of ingress closing up, then it would be apparent that this had been a problem, and it wasn't just recent. Yes.
Thank you. In your witness statement, you say that when you went on the visit, you think there may have been some cleaning done before you went there, and then you're asked at the top of page 420 about the comment, some cleaning may have been carried out. Can you just tell us what you discovered about cleaning before the site visit?
Nothing. I didn't know anything about what had been done or what hadn't been done before the site visit.
But did you not then discover that some cleaning had been done?
Yes, I think it was my conversation with the pest control contractor following my return to work that day. I think I met the pest control contractor that time, and he told me that they'd been out over the weekend doing some cleaning, which is would be part of the course. If there was an issue, it's normally addressed as soon as possible.
Yeah. So can we just look at the top of page 420? What you say there is that on hearing that the IMT had suggested there was a link between pigeon infestation, presumably, and the illnesses, Mary-Ann Kane had instructed, I think that would that be Colin Purdon, probably?
Oh, sorry, yes, it's...
rather Ian Perry, but it's Colin Purdon, to carry out deep cleaning in the affected areas.
Yes.
The risk that's caused by pigeon droppings, sometimes called a health and safety risk, is that a risk to health, or is it a risk of physical injury like slipping?
Well, I think for my perspective, up until 2018, it was a health and safety risk, just as you described it. It's slipping, and also from an aesthetic point of view, that it looks dreadful as well.
Yeah. And you say further down page 420 that when it comes to plant rooms, prior to you being alerted about this in 2019, you weren't aware of an issue in plant rooms. Now, logically, that's presumably because not many people go there.
Yes. Yes, or the fact that if there had been an issue and it had been reported through the help desk, then I would necessarily have been made aware of it.
I mean, is it fair to say, I mean, you told us just a moment or two ago that it was clear that the issue with pigeons ingressing and causing mess wasn't a new one. That was your reaction, I think, when I asked you about it.
For the hospital sites in general, certainly my understanding was that it was more external buildings, I was surprised to find the amount of pigeons that had actually accessed the building, or the plant rooms themselves. Normally I was used to dealing with things that were happening outside.
Yes. I'm just trying to get a picture here. Could we look at bundle 24, volume 1, page 62? This is just is this the kind of record that's made when some action is taken?
Yes.
And we see here that this is a date in 2016, so you were not in post at that time. But we
No.
see that the pest control action has been to remove a dead pigeon from the plant room,
Yes.
which would support your argument or your statement that there have been issues for some considerable time.
Well, as I say, I wasn't aware of it so much being internal. It was more external at the time, but yes. I mean, that would have been the action that would have been taken, would be somebody has phoned the help desk have called them out, and the dead pigeon has been removed. So
Could we look, please, at the same bundle 24, volume 1, page 83? Now, this is a report from GP Environmental. There, I think the regular pest control firm that was used when you were at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, is that correct?
that's correct, yes.
And in fact, this is said that the works were requested by Mr. David Bratty, and the date is March 2017. So this is again before you were back in your post. But we see there that the discussion is of deep clean and sanitization of pigeon fouling, etc., to plant rooms and walkways.
Yeah.
So again, plant rooms seem to have been an issue in 2017.
Yes, looks like it.
And we see from that, we see from that report that there's discussion of heavy build-up of pigeon fouling on ledges, beams, walls, floors, and walkways of the plant rooms. Were you aware of the existence of this report, for instance, when you came?
No, I wasn't.
Might just move to page 101. So here we have another report. The date is June 2018. So this is after your arrival back. We see there's a calling out to remove pigeon carcass from the plant room again, located, etc. Were you aware that a dead pigeon had been removed from plant room area?
No, as I say, because the process would have been for the help desk to be phoned, to be contacted, to ask the pest control company to come out to address it. I wouldn't be made aware of all pest control reports.
Yeah, thank you. Can we then just look at 127? There's another environmental report that's headed, or somebody's written on it anyway, deep clean and sanitization of a particular area. And there's a reference on the right-hand side, damage from pigeon fouling. Now, yeah, to pipe lagging. Is this anything you were aware of?
No, I can't say it was. No.
Thank you. And I think in your witness statement, you're quite complimentary about GP Environmental in terms of the turnout times. Is that fair?
Yes, they were normally very responsive, yes.
So could we look forward then to another document, page 115, the same bundle. So here we are. Now there's something with your name on it.
Yes.
The 8th of January. So what seems to have happened there is that you and Colin Purdon have met with the individual from GP Environmental. Is that Mr. Bryden?
Alan Bryden, yes.
Yeah. What were you wanting him to do?
Well, we wanted him to put together a programme of work to be able to clean every plant room within the hospital site, and to take effect, as well as to install proofing or block up any gaps in the buildings that pigeons may be able to access.
Because GP Environmental are talking about a significant health and safety issue. Did that
Yes.
surprise you?
Yes, I haven't seen that in reports before from them. I don't remember. So so yes, it was a surprise for them to put that in, but I didn't query it any further. I didn't ask why they had added that to their report. I just assumed that because of the aesthetically how bad it looked, about possible slips and trips falls, but also the fact that there may have been a connection to the recent outbreaks in the wards.
You may not be able to tell me about this, but if someone in your position gets a report from an external contractor flagging up a significant health and safety issue, do you report that to anyone else?
Well, what I reported back to the IMT that was taking place was that I had actioned that I'd received the report from GP Environmental and actioned a period of a programme of works to get rid of the pigeon mess and to install proofing where required. So I don't know that I shared that particular report with anybody, other than report back to the IMT that we're taking actions to rectify the situation.
Yeah. Because it's not just plant rooms they're talking about there. They're talking about many locations, and then they list examples: walkways, plant rooms, ledges, and then various other parts of the building.
Yes.
What you do say in your witness statement, if we could go back to that at 421, you say right at the foot of that page, you could have had inspections of the plant rooms carried out, which might have prevented the problem arising to such a level. And you say there are about 30 plant rooms that would have had to have been inspected.
Yes, I can't remember the number of plant rooms. It could be more than that, but there are significant numbers of them. But with hindsight, yes.
So once you'd instructed GP Environmental, were they visible for quite a period on site?
Yes, they were on site daily for a period of weeks, if not months.
And were you involved in liaising with them over that period?
Yes, I met with Alan Bryden, the Director of Operations, on a regular basis, sometimes with Colin Purdon, other times my own, or sometimes if I wasn't available, Colin would meet with Alan just for him to give us an update in terms of what had been done and what was still to be done.
Now, I'm not going to necessarily dig them out, but do you understand that photographs had been taken of pigeon mess in a whole variety of locations?
Yes.
And were you shown these at the time?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm moving on from pigeons to one or two miscellaneous points, if I may. Can we go back, if you don't mind, to your time around the handover of the hospital, because the project group that you were a member of overlapped handover in the sense that we know handover was in January 2015. The project group didn't end until August 2015. Patient migration was, well, depending on which part it was, in between these two dates.
Yes.
I think you were asked in your questionnaire, you responded in the witness statement about whether training to staff on all the new things they needed to know proved easy to organise and effective. Do you remember any particular difficulties with that?
I think it was, I think just freeing people up from their day job to be able to attend the training. And also about the level of training in terms of some pieces of equipment. I mean, for example, the automatic guided vehicles, that was quite a complex system. And I would say, you know, even several months after handover, we were still learning, or the guys that were operating the system were still learning about it. So, well, some systems were quite simple, it was straightforward, the right people attended. Other systems needed a lot more in-depth training, which I think eventually we ended up having to pay for more training on the systems than what we got, than what had been agreed within the contract. So I'd say, yeah, with some of the more complicated systems, we required more training than it was originally provided.
Thank you. So would that have taken longer? I suppose that the question I have in my mind is whether it should have started earlier.
Starting early might not have been possible because, again, it was about freeing up our staff that were going to be operating the system to be able to attend. And also it's about the completion of the system installation, whether it was at the point of readiness to be able to provide training on it.
Thank you. We've had some evidence from other witnesses about pressure on staff at these early times. Do you remember anything about staff coming under pressure in terms of volume of work hours or anything like that?
Yes, within the management team, there was pressures in terms of just being able to provide cover for everything we were doing. We also had to use agencies, a lot of agency staff initially for like domestic catering, poaching posts, to get the departments up and running before the other staff migrated over with the hospitals. So, and then of course staff moving in from other hospitals, they had to get familiarisation, induction. They were coming into, they had their own anxieties about working in a new environment where they'd maybe left a place of work that they'd been based in for 20 years. So we had that sort of anxiety from our own staff as well. So you were dealing with that, and then converging, you know, a number of large hospital sites onto the one site, just in terms of volumes of staff, was also quite challenging as well.
And did this have any impact on the number of hours that people were working at the time?
Well, certainly, probably from a domestic catering portering assistant job, maybe not so much, but I think when you got down to the supervisory level or from the management level, then there was a lot of 7-day working, 12-hour shifts on a regular basis that was being worked. So, yeah.
Thank you. Let me just ask you one specific question, which is not connected directly to that at all. You were asked in your witness statement about whether concerns had been raised with you it would have to be in 2018 possibly, unless it was when you were there as cover, about the quality of cleaning in some of the units of the hospital. Can I first ask you, can you remember questions being raised with you about qualities of cleaning?
Yes, when I had not long moved over to the Queen Elizabeth in January, well, maybe it'd been January, February of 2018, Susie Dodds and Dr. Inkster asked to meet me to discuss the cleaning arrangements within the Children's Hospital, in particular around Ward 2A and 2B. They'd informed me that they'd spoken to my predecessor about it before, but they still felt that there was issues around it. So we had discussions about it. Certainly, I spoke to the domestic manager, and we reacted to the issues they had raised and sorted them out. But I understand that Susie Dodds and Theresa Inkster still had anxiety, so we ended up sort of re-looking at the domestic service model we were providing to 2A and 2B, and we enhanced the hours, and we had closer supervision of the wards as well to try and alleviate the concerns they had about the cleaning within those wards.
Thank you. My lord, this would probably be an appropriate time to take a break so that I can also take stock about any further questions.
Ms. Connelly, as I said, we usually take a coffee break. Could I ask you to be back for what with us is 11:45, but probably with you is 1:45.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Connell.
I'm obliged, my lord. Having reviewed matters, I have no further questions for this witness. Thank you.
And do I understand you've taken the opportunity to check with the room as to whether there's any proposed questions?
That is correct.
Right. Ms. Connelly, that is the end of your evidence. Thank you very much for your attendance and your patience with the technology. Before you go, can I just recognize that it's not just a question of giving the oral evidence. There's a lot of work involved in preparing to do that. Can I thank you very much for the work you did in helping with the preparation of your written statement. But we can now leave you to the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, my understanding is that we are in a position to begin the next witness, albeit it will be Mr. McIntosh who will do that.
That is correct, my lord. The next witness is present and is also content to start, and Mr. McIntosh is primed and ready to ask the questions.
Right. Well, if that is suitable to everyone, we'll say goodbye to Mr. Connell for today and allow Mr. McIntosh to take his seat. I think I can still say good morning, Ms. Joannidis. As you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh, who's sitting opposite. But first, I understand you're prepared to take the oath. Could I ask, sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. As you've probably gathered already, we plan to sit until 1 o'clock. We'll take a lunch break then. I would anticipate we'll be asking you to return at 2 o'clock. However, if there's any stage in the evidence you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we'll take a break. what I very often say to a witness is, bear in mind this is quite a large space. You've got the help of the microphones, but maybe speaking a little louder, a little slower than usual conversation. Now, Ms. McIntosh.
Thank you, my lord. Ms. Joannidis, can I ask your full name? And I understand you're retired.
Yes.
So what was your occupation? What's your full name and what was your occupation before you retired?
So my full name is Pamela Anna Maria Joannidis.
And what was your occupation before you retired?
Before I retired, I was infection control nurse in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and before that in York Hill NHS Trust.
Thank you. Now, you produced a statement, I understand, for the inquiry.
Yes.
Are you prepared to adopt that as part of your evidence?
Yes.
Now, that, of course, means that we don't need to go through it line by line. We can read it, His Lordship and I have obviously read it, and the court participants have read it too. So what I'm proposing to do is just pick out a few key issues that are covered in it. What I first want to do is just to understand from you what the role of an infection control nurse is, perhaps in contrast to a doctor working in the same field in infection control. So what is the difference, in a sense, between the two?
Usually an infection control nurse works full time in that post and doesn't have any other duties, whereas the infection control doctor would usually be the consultant microbiologist and would have some sessions out of the week to do infection control doctor type work. Infection control doctors would usually sit within a laboratory and would normally would be the first person to see microbiology results. They would provide advice on antimicrobial prescribing, whereas the infection control nurse would not give advice generally on antimicrobial prescribing.
What particular things would an infection control nurse be giving advice on?
So essentially standard infection control precautions as in the National Infection Control Manual, so Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of the manual. So standard precautions would be hand hygiene, decontamination of equipment, decontamination of the environment, and would do education and support education for staff around that. They would be involved in audit of all of those precautions and would liaise generally with staff in clinical environments to support the application of standard infection control precautions.
When it comes to the decision to acquire new equipment or, in extreme cases, build new facilities, would there be a difference in the way that infection control doctors and nurses would be involved in those sort of projects?
Yes, infection control nurse is not a subject matter expert in water or ventilation and therefore wouldn't be invited to give advice and wouldn't be that person giving that advice, whereas the infection control nurse would be giving advice on the layout of a ward, particular processes around bed to dirty utility room or clean utility room, bed spacing and the general layout of a ward. They would also be expected to give advice about the number of hand hygiene sinks and the location of those sinks.
If a infection control nurse had a particular additional qualification in something like water or ventilation, presumably they would be able to give advice on that, but generally they wouldn't. Is that what you're saying?
If that was part of their job description and their contract to do that, then yes. And they had that appropriate qualification, then yes. But yes. So,
and from your perspective as an infection control nurse, and a relatively senior one, we'll come to that, what's the role of doctors, infection control doctors, in choosing new equipment or procuring new facilities, in contrast or in the same?
So I would expect that infection control doctors would be involved in the more technical aspects of the new build around water systems and ventilation, particularly for at-risk patients, so intensive care, neonatal intensive care, hemato-oncology units.
Thank you. Now, I think the next question is, I think you've already answered half of them. I'll just go through them just to be clear. If you are in a situation where a decision has to be made about what water testing to do in a place, particularly when to do it, where to test, and what to test for, would that decision be made by infection control doctors or infection control nurses?
That would certainly be infection control doctors.
And that's because of their microbiological background?
Yes.
Right. In terms of the water system in a hospital, I can see you've explained that a nurse wouldn't necessarily have the skills and the background and experience to take views on a water system. But as we get closer to the wash hand basin, does infection control nurses get more involved in the sort of ends of the system, a water system, and how it's cleaned and kept secure?
What do you mean by ends?
Well, for example, if you have a sink where there is a question about whether it's being kept properly clean, or is it being used sufficiently often, would that be an issue that would concern an infection control nurse, or is it entirely a matter for infection control doctors?
So, in terms of the cleaning of a sink, there are national cleaning standards, and that would be domestic services. Infection control nurses might look at the use of that sink, and they're designated hand hygiene sinks. So what you might find is that a sink is actually being used for other purposes as well, like pouring liquids down it, that kind of thing. So infection control nurse would make sure that was the case. In terms of that, the technical side of that sink, any microbiological sampling would be the infection control doctor who would do that. In terms of the technical aspects of what is behind the IPS panel, that would be facilities and estates working in collaboration with the infection control team.
Yes, because the example I'm thinking of, we've heard evidence yesterday of a particular time when it was necessary to inspect a ward before patients were moved into it. And this inspection was carried out by an infection control nurse. And it involved finding out there were problems with the showers and the water system. I'm just trying to see how hard this boundary is about whether infection control nurses get involved in water systems.
So the infection control nurse would have a visual look. That's as much as they can do, and they can't see, obviously, and they don't know the technical aspects of what's behind the wall, the panel that the sink and the tap are attached to. So it would be a visual inspection. They would also liaise with the clinical team at ward level, and as you say, ask them if there had been any problems, and that would be an opportunity for the clinical team to highlight any concerns about if the water was running slow, and on occasions, if they might tell the infection control nurse, well, actually, we don't use that sink. So that then becomes what's described as a little used outlet.
Right.
And that would then be, the infection control nurse could give that information to the Estates and Facilities Department to say that there's an option there. Number one, you make sure it's flushed anyway, even though it's not used, or you remove that sink.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to move to the period before the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital opened. And if we can just start with your professional history. So I wonder if page 429 of the statement bundle can put on the screen in front of you so we can see. I just want to, 429, please. You provided a compact CV in that section. And I'm just going to put some things I understand from this, and I want you to stop me if I've got it wrong, effectively. That in the period between 2007 and 2013, you were a lead infection and prevention control nurse in the South sector.
Yes.
Yes. And that included a range of different hospitals, which you've listed there. And then from January 13 to March 19, you are promoted to be a nurse consultant.
Yes.
Yes. But whilst you're a nurse consultant, you go and set up the new paediatric infection prevention control team in the Royal Hospital for Children.
Yes.
In the new building.
Yes.
And you did that part-time while still being a nurse consultant.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to connect this to other evidence, that role is taken over by Susan Dodd in March 2017.
Yes. And
you then return to being a full-time nurse consultant.
Yes.
Right. And then you become acting Associate Director of Nursing from March 2019. And then in March 2022, you retire.
Yes, I retired from GGC.
Excellent. Now, the reason I wanted to check that is because the first period I want to look to you is whilst you're in that South Sector job. So that's before January 2013. Now, in your statement on page 433, you discuss at the bottom half of the page a meeting which you haven't given a date for.
Yes.
Now, of course, you're retired, so I was presumably you haven't got access to all your work emails. So what I'm trying to do is try and make sure we're talking about the same thing at this
Yes.
point. So I wonder if you look at bundle 14, volume 1, page 11. Now, this appears to be, to me, to be an email that ultimately has been forwarded on to Dr. Inkster at the top, but 2/3 of the way down the page is an email from Heather Griffin to Alan Seaborn, Peter Moyer, and Brian Cowan. It doesn't copy you in, but it describes that the meeting took place
Yes.
with Tom Walsh, Annette Ranking, and Pamela Joannidis to review and finalise the infection control advice for the isolation rooms in the new South Glasgow Hospital. And then it describes what almost looks like cut and paste from a minute.
Yes.
Do you think this might be around the time of these meetings you're talking about at this point in your statement?
Yes, I think it must be round about that time. I think in my statement I said my memory of that time. And I think I was talking about that, but I might have got people who were at that meeting wrong, but yes.
In fact, we can see a minute of the meeting that I've found this morning, bundle 23, page 46. We might look at that instead, because then at least we're looking at the meeting itself. Yes. So this appears to be a minute on the 18th of May, 2009 at 1 o'clock, and you're recorded as one of the 7 people present.
Yes.
Now, in the text of the document, there's the group reviewed the paper from Doctors Redding and Hood and Annette Rankin. We don't have the paper, but I want to look at the minute with this.
Okay.
This sits in the timeline of the procurement of the hospital at a point before the competitive dialogue between the 3 final tenderers, which commenced in June 2009. So what I'd like to understand is what you thought the purpose of this meeting was in the procurement. Have you a recollection of why you were meeting?
My understanding of this meeting was that the project team wanted to know what isolation. So we already knew that the hospital was to be 100% single room.
Right.
But within that, the project team were looking for advice on how many mechanically ventilated rooms might be required.
Because at that time, as far as you know, and as far as you remember, there'd been a decision about whether the hospital was to be entirely mechanically ventilated or partly mechanically and partly naturally ventilated.
I don't know.
It's the reason I asked that is because the way you phrase that last answer. You talked about how many mechanically ventilated rooms would there be? Well, if it's all sealed windows, they're all mechanically ventilated. And I wonder if that being something that would have been discussed around about this time.
Sorry, no, by that I meant special ventilation
Special
as opposed
ventilation.
to...
Okay. Now, in this minute, it records...
I think you've been entirely clear about this. You accept that your understanding would be that all spaces in the hospital would have some mechanical
Yes.
ventilation, in other words, achieving certain specifications.
Yes.
But what you're being asked about was spaces or rooms which would require enhanced,
Yes.
higher specifications. Right. Thank you.
And then within this minute, 2/3 of the way down the page, it has a heading, hemato-oncology. Now,
Yes.
am I right in thinking that by this point, the decision to move the adult bone marrow transplant unit in hasn't been made? So this must be what is ultimately Ward 2A.
Yes.
Yes, right. Now, do you remember this being a one-off meeting or there being other meetings?
So my memory in my statement was a meeting with different people, including Alan Seaburn.
Yes, that's what I'm
But
wondering.
I can't honestly.
I mean, how vivid is
say.
your memory of a meeting with Mr. Seaborn? That's what I'm trying to think.
I just know we met.
Right.
And
Well,
I'm sure we met with Dr. Haig, infectious diseases consultant. But I can't remember the details.
no, that's fine. So what I want to do is now put this in context. So this is a meeting about the specialist ventilation facilities for these specialist rooms. At this point, had there been any discussion that you can remember about the general ventilation for the hospital as a whole?
I don't remember any discussion. I just remember conversations that the appropriate SHTMs were being followed in terms of all systems for the hospital. And I think I got that from Jackie Barman-Roy, who was the
Around about then?
consultant. Not then, Jackie wasn't employed then.
So that would have been later?
It would have been later.
Right, okay. But at this point, what you're being asked is about the specialist facilities?
Yes.
Right.
And that was about numbers of specially enhanced ventilation rooms.
Yes, and I want to check the answer that's recorded. Sealed ward with HEPA filtration positive to the rest of the hospital. In practical terms, does that mean there would be a lobby on the entrance to the ward?
Yes.
Yeah.
Our understanding of that was that was the description of the existing Schahalian unit at York Hill.
I think we've heard evidence about that. Right.
And there is an airlock. I don't know what the technical term would be, but it's an airlock with 2 doors. And there's a system of going into one, waiting, and then going into the next to get into the ward.
Thank you. Now, what I want to do is to go back to your statement, which is to page 432 of your statement bundle. You describe, in answer to 7A at the bottom, that Annette Rankin, who was then your line manager, invited you to attend some preliminary 1 to 200 planning meetings with a number of adult clinical teams. We go to the page. Would these be meetings where 1 to 1,200 architectural drawings are being looked at?
1 to 200, yes.
Yes. And
sorry, my fault, Ms. McIntosh. Are we still on 433?
yes, we're now on 432, but yes, 433,
Right.
yeah.
Thank you.
So if we go to 433, and these are preliminary drawings. Now, this is when Jackie Barmanori was there. So we'll obviously have to check her dates with her. But would this have been at a point when there was a single bidder, no bidder, or 3 bidders? As far as you remember.
I couldn't tell.
The reason I ask this is we're aware that in June, July, and August of 2009, there's a process where, in what's called a competitive dialogue, there are a series of programmed and structured meetings at which different people from the health board meet different people from the bidder and discuss different aspects of the hospital. And one of those sessions looks at 1 to 200 drawings, and that's in 2009. And then there's other evidence that there's a 1 to 200 drawing session happens later, after 2009. I'm trying to work out which one you're talking about. Can you help me about whether it was in 2009 or later?
So it would be certainly before Jackie was employed as the full-time nurse consultant. And I think it probably was round about that time, but I'm sorry, I don't have access to records.
Could I ask you to go to Bundle 14, Volume 1, page 32, which is an email jumping forward in time from 2013. Now, this obviously is the best part of 4 years later, and the hospital is now being constructed, or construction is underway. And what I need to do before we go too far into this is just to work out who everyone is for the purposes of the hearing. So at this point, you'd now been promoted to nurse consultant?
Nurse consultant.
Yes. And who was Mr. Walsh?
Tom Walsh was the infection control manager.
And who then was Sandra McNamee?
She was the Associate Nurse Director for the Infection Control
And
Service.
we see her later in papers as Sandra Devine.
Sandra Devine.
Yes. And Craig Williams, what role did he then play?
Craig Williams was the lead infection control doctor and the infection control doctor for the paediatric service.
And then Jackie Stewart, what role did she play?
So Jackie was in my team as a senior infection control nurse. She had been for many years, and she was offered the post of nurse consultant. She applied for the post and was successful.
But she'd been working for you for a long time.
She had been working with me for the length of time that I think for the length of time that I was in the South sector.
I see, right.
I
Now,
think.
there's a discussion here of a meeting. Now that you've sent a report to various people, the people here, and you discuss what various rooms are to have. And I notice you'll see the fourth paragraph goes, we discussed mechanically ventilated isolation rooms. The NCH, which I'm presuming is National Children's Hospital,
Yes.
will have 24 lobbied ensuite rooms, 6 in PICU, 2 in the observation ward, 3 in hemato-oncology, and the rest scattered throughout the building in clusters of 2. Now, the question I want you to ask you is, this appears to be different from what is recorded in the 2009 minute, where it's described that the whole of the hemato-oncology ward will be positive pressure to the whole of the hospital with HEPA filters. Can you explain why that change has happened?
So by this I meant BMT rooms, 6 BMT rooms, but it doesn't mean the ward wasn't still going to be a sealed unit. At that point, I still understood it to be a sealed.
So in
positive.
2013, you still understood it to be a sealed
That
unit?
was my understanding.
And
Sorry, just so that I'm keeping up. Notwithstanding the precise terms of the email, which is an email, not a conveyancing document, your understanding was that the plan for what became Ward 2A was a lobby to the rest of the hospital,
Yes.
in addition to at least some of the rooms being lobbied.
Yes.
Right. I think you said that quite clearly. It's just, I need to be sure that I'm keeping up. Sorry, Ms. Smith.
not at all. And then if we can move on to page 42, which is an email sent to you on the 3rd of July 14. And again, of course, this is a long time ago, and you've only seen it a few days ago when we gave you notice. We have again the number of isolation rooms, and I'd like to understand what this table might mean, if you can help me. So the top row of the table appears to say NCH, Observation Ward 2, and we had that in the previous email a year before. And PICU 4, that's still the case. But now we have 2 in cardiology, 2 in AIU, and 6 in general wards, rather than scattered around the hospital, which we had before. Do you want to look at the previous page?
No, carry on.
Yeah, so the question I want to ask is, firstly, there are now 8 recorded for Schehallien, whereas previously there were 6 recorded. Can you explain what's going on there? Has there been a change that you're aware of, or?
So I wasn't aware. I can see the number has changed, but I wasn't involved in conversations. I would have assumed that was a negotiation with the clinical team around what they felt was the business case for the number of rooms.
I see. And then at the bottom of the table, it has NSGH. That presumably is the adult hospital.
Sorry, yes.
And it has 10 in critical care, 2 in renal high acuity. Now, I appreciate that you might not have been involved in this. And then it has 24 in hemato-oncology HEPA filtration not lobbied. Now, are you able to help me about what ward that is ultimately talking about?
My understanding there, that was the proposal for Ward 4B,
Or B?
which
So
became
there's
the adult.
So there's at this point in this email, there is a suggestion that there would be HEPA filters in 4B,
Yes,
but no lobby.
yes.
And ultimately 4B acquires HEPA filters and a lobby, but it takes a bit longer.
Yes.
Right. Now, what I want to ask is, I asked you about 2013, what was your understanding about the Schiehallion unit and whether it would have a lobby and be HEPA filtered? Was that still your understanding in 2014 in July?
Yes.
When did you realise that it wasn't going to be HEPA filtered and positive pressure to the rest of the hospital?
I became the acting lead infection control nurse for the service around October 2015, and I asked the team to take me round and walk me round the unit. And at that point, I realised I wasn't going into an airlock before I went into the Schiehallion ward. And that's when I realised it wasn't airlocked.
So it's October
The
of
following
15.
year.
Now, you mentioned a little bit ago in my questions that you had been assured back in 2009 that the relevant SHTMs would be followed, and it was the words used. When did you realise that the air change rate in 2A was somewhat lower than it might have been required to be, to some people's eyes, in SHTM 0301?
It was some time after I became the lead nurse for the service, but I can't remember if that was when Dr. Inkster took over, and we started to look at, or whether it was when I started, they were already looking at the seals round.
Well, we'll come back to those. We're going to look at those documents.
So I can't quite remember.
Now, you have explained to me that you don't consider that infection control nurses, I'm assuming this includes you, are the right people to ask what the requirements are of SHTM 0301 in terms of ventilation. Have I got that right?
Absolutely.
However, numbers get bandied around, and I'm not so much interested in whether you think they're right, but what you were told. So if we go back to 2009, at that point, was there any discussion of what the air change rate would be in the hemato-oncology unit that was planned in the Children's Hospital?
I don't recall.
When's the first time?
conversation.
Sorry, you don't recall that being discussed?
I don't recall.
When's the first time that someone said to you a number for air change rate in Ward 2A?
I think it might have been when I took over as lead.
And that would have been October
of
17.
2015.
Or, given that you said the time might have been when Dr. Inkster arrived, one of those two times.
I think it was about then.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't get.
Sorry.
I have to say, I'm hard of hearing, Ms. Joannidis. I just didn't get that date.
I think it was round about October 15, or it might have been when Dr. Inkster started a little bit further down the line.
But it's certainly not before October 15.
I don't think so, no.
Now, what I want to do is look at you. Sorry, look at your answer to question 14A, which is on page 435 of your statement. Now, the reason I wanted to look at this is your first reaction to the hospital. Is it coming up? It is coming up on screens, right? Yes. So you recorded there that your first reaction was very big and the footfall was enormous. It looked new, clean, and modern. Now, given that you've described going into the Schiehallion unit in October of that year and going, where's the lobby, effectively, what was the point when, or was there a point when the impression you get out there doesn't quite connect to what you've seen? Is there a point of when you've got a clean modern hospital but there's no lobby? How are you reacting to that?
I was surprised. My first reaction, I didn't go straight to Schiehallion when I first started, but when I did go into the ward, I realised there was no lock, and I did ask. I did say, why is there no lock? I don't remember the response from Professor Williams, but I did ask why it wasn't airlocked, because our understanding throughout the whole process was that Schiehallion would be like for like. What it was in York Hill, which is what we would get in the new hospital.
So could it be that this moment when you first went in is actually a few days or weeks before October 17?
Yes, it will be.
Right. Could it have been before patients started arriving in the building in April?
No.
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 Right. Now, I've got a series of emails to show to you in a moment that suggest that you were involved in a series of meetings or conversations with Professor Williams, Dr. Inkster, Sandra Devine, and others in May 15 about the isolation rooms in Ward 2A. Does that ring a bell with you? Well, let's look at them and see how we get on.
Let's look, and I can
Can
comment.
we look at bundle 14, volume 1, page 200, please? Now, this appears to be halfway down the page. At the bottom of the page is an email from Professor Williams to Jennifer Armstrong, who was then, I think, medical director, copied to Sandra Devine and Mr. Walsh, but it's ultimately forwarded on to you and Claire Mitchell on the 5th of June 2015. So this is before you've been in the building, I'm assuming, been in the ward.
Yes.
And they're describing various issues that they noticed. And the third paragraph is, upon investigating, Mary Ann Kane, I think it is, found that the HEPA filters had not been fitted. If this is the case, that we will be unable to validate the rooms. And then there's a discussion that it would potentially unsafe to move people in. Now, what I wanted to understand is, to how much were you aware that there were some issues? They're quite specific, but some issues with ventilation in the new or fit out of the new ward before you arrived in October 2015.
So I was included in this because at that point Claire Mitchell had given she was resigning. She was moving on to NHS Lanarkshire, I think. So at that point I had already been asked if I could step in. We had an adult and paediatric team, and the decision had been taken that that team would be split into two, and that I was asked to form a paediatric team at that point. So I started to be included in conversations, anything to do with the ward, because I would ultimately be stepping into Claire's role.
So these emails, and there are others, would appear to all take the form of Sandra Devine forwarding it on to you after she's received it.
Yes.
And that's to keep you informed.
To keep me up to date so that I would be aware of what was going on.
Well, we won't need to go to all of them then, but perhaps if we could go to an email on the 3rd of July 2015, which is on page 278. And this is about the sealing of the light fittings. So what I want to do is just, it occurs to me that you've said that your first visit to the ward was in October 15. Could it be it was a bit earlier, given this email is sent to you and Mr. Walsh in July 15, and it's about sealing of light fittings in room 17 and 18?
It might have been. Teresa and I did visit the ward. I don't remember at what point, but whether that was when she started or before that. But Teresa had moved over to the Southern as regional ICD, regional services ICD, I think. And it might well have been that we went to the ward before I actually took over.
Because the reason that it's a few things interesting about this email sequence is, firstly, you've sent an email at the bottom to Dr. Inkster on the 3rd of July, and you're providing her with information about the 8 rooms, and that sampling has taken place. And what's intriguing to me is that you've not mentioned the lobby. And so it occurs to me there are a couple of different explanations that we could run with here. One is that you've not met the lobby yet because you've not actually been there. The other is that you didn't think it was necessary to mention that there was no lobby in exchange about testing for the ward, or there's another explanation, and I'm trying to work out what you think might be going on here.
I think I might have been wrong about the date that I first
Right. So
was
could
in
it
the
have been
ward.
that you would have visited the ward
So it's in
after getting
July.
into these email exchanges?
So this might have been July, because that last email there from me to Teresa, it looks as if I've actually been in the ward, doesn't
Yes.
it? And I talk about Magna Helix gauges, etc. So unless I got that information from the infection control team, that might have been me doing that.
So what I'm just trying to understand, and I appreciate that you don't have access to a whole sequence of emails, and you are retired, you have got access to all the information. But if it was appropriate, and it seems to have made sense, to raise the question of the absence of sealing of light fittings in BMT isolation rooms, why would it not then have been appropriate around that time to have raised the issue in a similar way about the absence of a lobby for the whole ward?
The first time I stepped into the ward was when I realised it didn't have the lobby at the front door, and that's when I raised that question. It's not included in this email, but I did raise it just after I...
Do you recollect what the answer was? That seems to be the problem for us.
I think, I can't remember the answer. I don't think I was given an explanation.
Right.
I think people didn't know why it didn't have the lobby, because that was the expectation.
Now, what I wanted to do is to go to page 280. So this email thread ultimately reaches you. Well, it doesn't. It starts at the bottom, and so it's rather difficult to read because
thank you.
And at the very top, we have an email to Professor Williams from Dr. Inkster copied into you, where she says in the first sentence, "I've still not seen copies of the original specification for the unit." And so would that seem to confirm your idea that you didn't know why there wasn't a lobby?
Sorry, I don't...
So
ask a question again.
You've noticed there's no lobby.
Yeah.
You've explained that you've raised the matter with Professor Williams. Here are exchanges in July of that year about the original specification for the unit. And it seems possible that some people don't know what the original specification of the unit is at this point. The specification would presumably include the presence or absence of a lobby. It might include other things too. But are we to take it that at this point in 2015, you, and presumably Dr. Inkster, didn't know what the whole specification for the Schiehallion unit was?
That's correct.
Now, when it comes to the question of positive pressure ventilated lobby rooms, were you involved in collecting information together about whether they were fit for purpose in this summer of 2015?
So I do remember, prior to that, a visit to Great Ormond Street, but I don't know if it was in connection to this, because they had PPVL rooms in Great Ormond Street, and I went with the delegation. I can't remember the date.
Because there's some suggestion in guidance, albeit you explain that guidance isn't part of your responsibilities, that positive pressure ventilation lobby rooms aren't suitable for hemato-oncology patients. That's something you've heard of before?
So I've read that those rooms might not be appropriate because of difficulties with the technical spec. When I was ICN in Schiehallion, we were particularly keen that the solution for a new hospital or an upgrade to the existing would be that we could protect immunocompromised children
Yes.
in a room. But at the same time, if they had an airborne infection, we would be able to maintain that child in that room and have that both protective and make sure that the infection didn't seep out into the rest of the ward.
So this is a combination of you want to both protect the child and protect the ward.
And protect the ward.
And that addresses the problem that a normal positive pressure ward room or a normative negative pressure room
Yes.
would be unsuitable for one of those two things.
Yes. In the original ward in York Hill, if a Schahalian child had an infection that was spread, like chickenpox by airborne,
Yes.
they would have to be moved to what was then the infectious diseases ward. And that was not necessarily always great in terms of disruption to the family, taking them away from the facilities that Schahalian had for parents, and also the medical staff having to go between different wards.
So the idea behind using positive pressure ventilator, is that designed to solve that problem?
Well, that was my understanding, that could be a solution to that problem.
I'm not quite sure if I've
Yeah.
following this, Ms. McIntosh. If we go back to the first proposition that you put to
So whether
Ms.
you were asked to,
Joannidis, I wasn't as clear precisely what it was and where it came from. If I recollect correctly, what I have in mind is that you put the proposition that a positively pressured room may not have been the correct solution for a hemato-oncology patient. And that, as a proposition, surprised me, but maybe I didn't quite.
so that was the proposition I was putting.
Mhm.
But I'm conscious that this isn't the witness who has the expertise to answer it.
Mhm.
And she's responded, I think, by explaining her understanding of why other people thought that a positive pressure ventilated lobby room might be a helpful thing in the Schahalian unit.
Right.
So what I was going to do is I was going to leave that here and pick it up with someone who
Right.
has the technical knowledge
Right.
to answer the why.
Because, fair enough, if one feeds in the proposition that the room has a PPLV, in other words, a lobby to the rest of the
Yeah.
ward, I can see that may be a solution both to protect the patient and
It may
protect
be,
the
and I
ward.
think the problem is that there's some discussion at a technical level about this, but I don't think you're the person to ask the question. However, it's helpful to have the understanding of what the explanation was at the time. The final thing to finish this is when this ward is opening, how much understanding do you and the people operating the ward have of what sort of room this is and whether it's validated and good to go to be used?
So I wasn't involved. It was the local infection control team, and that would be Claire Mitchell and Professor Williams as the lead ICN and lead ICD.
So you hadn't yet taken over?
No.
Right, that explains. So
Sorry to interrupt again, Ms. McIntosh. You used the word validated, which I think we also see being used by Professor Williams in one of the earlier emails. At that time, I didn't ask because it's Professor Williams who's using the expression. Now you're using the expression. What do you mean by validated?
I'm just interested to see whether the word "these are the validations" has been said to this witness. Since I'm not too worried about what it meant at the time,
Right, okay.
I'm interested to see whether you were able to tell me that you've been told it had been validated. But since you weren't involved, you can't tell me that. So I'll have to ask someone else.
Yeah, so I think there was, I joined an operational group who were discussing, I think, on the move, when to send patients across and what patients, etc., from York Hill and when. And I was asked a question by Lynn Robertson, who was the service manager for paediatrics at that time. Would there have to be a period of, I don't know if validation's the right word, for the ventilation systems in the hospital before we move in? And I asked the infection control senior management team that question, and I was asked to refer to the project team, Francis McElrath, about that. So that's my involvement in that.
I see. What I want to do is just that, I mean, this document may not be relevant, so I'm just going to double check that I'm looking, that this is relevant to raise with you. Yes, so if we go to page 296 in this bundle, please. So this appears to be an email. If you just look at the bottom half of the page, it might be easier. It appears the original email is from Professor Williams to a group of people, of which you are one. And it says, note from the meeting about paediatric BMT held last night. I've discussed our actions with Pamela and she will take them forward. So you're being asked to do something. And on the next page in our bundle is a document headed update from meeting to discuss. If you go to the next page, please. Paediatric BMT. Now, given the way documents get handled, sometimes they get disconnected. Do you think this is the note of the meeting that is discussed in that email from 8th September?
I honestly couldn't say if that was actually.
Because the reason that I'm asking it
It's a
is
lot technical.
well, yes, but it is suggested that your Professor Williams has discussed his actions with you, and one would imagine somehow they arise out of this document. I mean, we don't know what he said. I mean, was it usual to receive very short emails from Professor Williams at this point? Or any emails at all?
It wasn't unusual.
Wasn't unusual. Did he send a lot of emails?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so.
I
don't know what you mean by a lot.
Well, I suppose that's the question, is that sometimes it's been suggested that some of the people involved in these events were more keen on emails than others.
Okay.
So when you arrived in this team, effectively, as it's being set up, did anyone give you any instruction that one shouldn't put things in emails? One should just talk to each other?
I don't recall being asked to do that.
Right.
I think email, because of the size of GGC and the 5 sectors across a real large geographical area, emails were really important.
What I want to do is scroll to the bottom of the next page, and I don't think this should be taken out of context, what's seen here, because at this point they're still doing work to these rooms and ceiling light fittings, and decisions are made to start transplants quite soon afterwards. But what I'm keen again to explore, and I suspect I may come against your memory at this point, but there's a discussion here of in the last risk assessment. It was agreed that the risk to patients was high if transplants were further delayed than proceeding in fully sealed rooms. So they've obviously carried out some form of risk assessment about using these rooms. Does that ring a bell as a decision problem that had to be addressed?
I don't remember that. I'm sorry.
The reason I'm asking it is because, are you aware what HAI scribe is?
Yes.
Had you seen or heard of an HAI scribe being done for the finishing of the new hospital?
No.
Had you seen one being done for this process of making changes and finalising Ward 2A?
I think when I took over, we appointed a senior ICN, and there was work to be done around the seals, around the doors,
Yes.
And my senior ICN put a scribe together with the estates around the nature of the work that was to be done. So that would be considering the disruption to the wards, seals, etc.
So there was HIS scribe for relatively small scale work in the ward.
Small scale work, yes.
But you've not seen an HIS scribe that says this ward is now finished, it meets the standard, it's been risk assessed?
No.
No. If we can go back to your statement, page 456, at 25B, I think you've already answered this, but I'm just going to see if we have a final go. 25B, you say the team was informed that the air change rate in the bedrooms was 3 air changes an hour, not 6. We were told this was due to being chilled beam technology and did not require 6 air changes. I think Dr. Inkster may have told us, but I cannot be certain. I had no prior knowledge of chilled beam technology. Now, it occurs to me there's a way I could ask this question that might jog your memory. You'd never come across chill beams before in a hospital.
No.
In fact, you didn't know what chill beam was.
Didn't know what they were.
So you go into the Schehallien unit and you go into these rooms. Had York Hill had single rooms?
Yes.
Yeah. You look up on the ceiling. Did you see the ventilation system and notice it on your first visits to the ward?
No.
Because you seem to be involved in discussions around light fittings being sealed.
Yes.
Could it be that you would have noticed the chilled beams relatively promptly on arrival?
I think it would be fair to say that we knew there was this flat box on the roof, on the ceiling, but not that it was causing problems. And it was when Teresa and I were made aware that there was drips coming from the chill beam, we went back and looked at these, and that's when we realised we didn't know what they were for. So, yes.
Is it possible this helps you to tell us whether the awareness of the air change rate is connected to that point when you start looking at chill beams or not?
It was Dr. Inkster who told me that it was 3 air changes, not 6. I don't remember when that was.
Well, we'll ask her. What I want to do now is to look at the same page down the bottom of 24D. Now, one of the things I want to understand is these gauges that you get outside doors. Now, I've had the advantage of going to the hospital and seeing rooms with such gauges fitted. And I've seen rooms without such gauges fitted. And it seems, would you agree that it's obvious to notice whether there is one or isn't one?
Yes.
Yes.
Well.
Or is it?
So, if the gauge is right outside the door, you might notice it more. If it was a little bit further down the corridor from the door, you might not automatically think that applies to that room.
So the question I want to ask is, how would you check the pressure differential between a room and the corridor if there was no gauge?
I don't think you could. Again, don't have the expertise.
No, we ask. But
I don't think you could.
As a user, you don't think you could?
I don't think you could.
Right. Given that in 2009, the proposal for the ward was positive pressure to the rest of the hospital, would you require a gauge to tell you whether you were at positive pressure to the rest of the hospital somewhere in and around the entrance to the ward?
The old Schehallien didn't have a gauge that I'm aware of. It might have done and I just didn't know that. But with the new hospital, everything was a little bit more, so there might have been an alarm, perhaps.
Did you notice the presence or absence of gauges around the entrance to the ward?
No.
No. When you're in the ward, the first few times, we obviously know there are the 8 isolation rooms in the ward. Did they have gauges outside the doors?
Yes,
What about the other rooms in the ward? Did they have gauges?
I don't remember them having gauges, sorry.
Now, if we could go on to page 442 of your statement, it's going backwards, but there's a systematic reason. It's about the adult bone marrow transplant unit. You've described, and I'm not going to go through it in a huge amount of detail, how you were aware that the adult bone marrow transplant unit, in fact, didn't arrive in the hospital. They, as it were, went back to the Beatson.
Retrofitted.
Yeah, and the work was done over the next year or so. What I wanted to understand is, what were you, at the time of your arrival in the Schiehallion unit, aware of what was going on in respect to the adult bone marrow transplant unit across in the adult hospital?
It must have been, yes.
Because the thing I'd like to understand, and maybe you can help me, is given that ultimately the Schiehallion unit stayed, but the adult unit went back, are you aware of why there was a difference in solution?
Do you mean why the
adult went back and the
pediatrics
Schiehallion
didn't go
stayed?
back to York Hill?
Yes.
I would imagine that's a clinical decision because the paediatric intensive care unit and the paediatric theatres had moved.
So the whole of York Hill had moved?
The whole of York Hill, but I wasn't party to those discussions.
Do you remember anyone explaining it to you at the time?
No.
No, okay. I'm now going to start what will unfortunately be a part of this afternoon, just looking at IMT minutes.
Yes.
So if we could start on bundle 1, document 1, because in your statement on question 21, you describe a IMT setup in respect of Serratia. Can you help me pronounce this? I've never learnt to pronounce this one.
Serratia marcescens.
Serratia marcescens, yes. So it's been set up in respect of Serratia marcescens. And I want to, before lunch, just ask you some general questions about IMTs, and we'll come back to specific ones. So what's the purpose of an IMT?
The purpose of an IMT is to bring relevant people together to discuss a situation where you either have a single organism of interest, such as Ebola, or you have 2 or more cases that are the same, that constitutes an outbreak, and you would have that, or you have a trend where you have more cases than you would expected of a particular organism.
So if we look at those 3 categories, if we take a sort of slightly less dramatic organism than Ebola, could you have a IMT for a single unusual microorganism?
Yes.
You could. And do you have to have one if there's more than 2 cases? Is that a rule or a piece of practice?
It's part of the guidance of the national manual that you would certainly have. You might not go to an IMT, but you'd certainly have a problem assessment group.
And that's a PAG?
And that's a PAG.
Right. But with the trend, would that be a new IMT because you've got a trend in your unit, or the extension of an existing one that's already looking at more than 2 cases?
Where you have an IMT looking at 2 or more cases, you would want to do a look back for other cases. So it might include looking at the data to see if there was indeed an exceedance.
An exceedance of what?
Exceedance of that particular organism over time.
If you're dealing with an organism that's remarkably rare, even in hemato-oncology patients, how do you know what is an exceedance? Surely an exceedance is just 1, or have I got that wrong?
It could be, depending on the organism.
Depending on the organism. Now, if we look at, again, the sort of generalities of IMTs, who are the relevant people? You called it relevant people. So who are the relevant people in an IMT? We might just do it by looking at the people at this IMT and discussing, without, I suppose, reading their names into the ether, working out why they're there. So the first person is easy. Professor Williams, he's the lead infection control doctor. That's
So
why
he would
he's
be the
there.
chair.
And you're there because you're the lead infection control nurse at that point. I'm assuming that the third person is possibly a treating clinician?
Clinical director for the service and, yes, a physician.
And Ms. Rogers was at that point the nursing director?
Chief nurse.
Chief nurse, right.
For the paediatric service.
And of the remaining people, other than Mr. McLeod, he takes a lot of these minutes, I notice.
Callum.
Would any of them been from facilities or estates?
Fiona Aitken, I'm not familiar with.
Well, maybe we just do in generality. So obviously we understand why the lead infection control doctor's there, and we understand why the lead infection control nurse is there, and I can understand why the treating clinician would want to be there. But who else would be an appropriate or relevant person to attend an IMT, just in generality?
Yeah, so it depends. You might have a preliminary meeting, and then through that meeting and discussing the cases, you might recognise that we need estates, we need facilities, we need microbiology lab. You might identify that you need someone else to join. So press office, although I can see there's press office there, you might not have that person at the first meeting, but you might decide we actually need that person for the next meeting. So where you don't have a relevant person following the discussions of the incident, you might then decide that they would be invited to the next meeting.
So when you invite someone from estates, what are you wanting from them, as it were?
So it depends. If your incident is about an exceedance of norovirus, you wouldn't necessarily invite estates, but you might invite the facilities cleaning services, soft FM.
Yeah.
Where you would invite estates would be where you think you have a potential source for your organism that involves the built environment.
I see. And why would you need a press officer?
So when you have an IMT, you do a HIAT assessment, which is assessment of the incident using a national tool.
Yes.
One of the criteria for assessing that is public anxiety. And when you look to discuss public anxiety, what we would be considering is if any parents had raised concerns, or when the adult, any patients had raised concerns, that would indicate that there was a higher level of anxiety. But we would also invite press to determine if there had been any press inquiries into the incident. It might also be that depending on the assessment, we might have to write a press statement, and the press office would be involved in writing that press statement.
It seems from reading a lot of IMTs in the last few weeks and months that they never seem to reach an ultimate conclusion. They never say, we think, well, generally don't say, we think it's X. There's much more talk of hypothesis, what you might describe as soft language, and not reaching a hard conclusion. Do you think that's fair? And if it is fair, why is that's where we end up with IMTs?
In my years as an ICN, my experience is that often you can't determine exactly that is the source, that is the route of transmission. I think you hypothesize right at the start what you think is the problem. You undertake your investigations. you put your control measures in place. And where you have no further cases, you make an assumption that the control measures that you've put in place have actually been the correct control measures.
I understand that, but I don't see, and this isn't a good example because it's one particular one, but I don't see records in the IMTs that we're looking at in this inquiry where people say we make the assumption that the control measures we put in place were effective. They don't actually write that down ever or have a wrap up at the end, a conclusion. Is that a fair criticism?
Yes.
Because I noticed that after the water incident, which we'll come to this afternoon, there is a wrap-up meeting that I think Miss Imrie chairs in May 2018. But that seems to be rather unusual. Do you think there should be more of these wrap-up meetings or ending processes?
Yes.
Um,
There's lessons learned, and there's a hot debrief tool in the National Manual that we can use to do that very thing. I can't remember when it came in. Into the National Manual. I don't remember the date, but there is a hot debrief tool, and yes, that's a useful tool to summarise, and it's also useful to share experience. We have 5 sectors in GGC, they have 5 sectors in GGC, and it's useful to share that hot debrief. It's also useful to provide that to RHI so that they can share the learning with other health boards.
Thank you. I think this is probably an ideal time to stop for lunch, Milord.
As I think I said, we usually take lunch between 1 and 2. So could I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock?
Thank you.
Right, we'll aim to sit again at 2.